And our recording, good. This meeting will be conducted in accordance with the California Government Code Section 54953E in consideration of the coronavirus COVID-19. All members of the Silicon Valley Clean Energy Executive Committee and staff will participate in this meeting by teleconference. Members of the public may observe this meeting electronically by accessing the meeting via instructions above or on our webpage. Public comments can be sent in advance of the meeting to the board clerk, also on the webpage, and will be read within the public comment period or the applicable agenda item. The public will also have an opportunity to provide comments during the meeting. Members of the public using Zoom may comment during the public comment or the applicable agenda item by using a raised hand feature, and you will be recognized by the chair. Those using the telephone, audio only, have a feature by pressing *9 on your phones to initiate the raised hand function in Zoom. You will then be announced, unmuted, and your time to speak will begin. The public may provide comments on any matter listed on the agenda. Speakers are customarily limited to 3 minutes. However, the committee chair may increase or decrease the time allotted to each speaker based on the number of speakers, the length of the agenda, and the complexity of the subject matter. Speakers' speaking time will not be decreased to less than 1 minute. If you are an individual with a disability and need a reasonable modification or accommodation pursuant to the American Disabilities Act, please contact the board secretary in advance of the meeting. Thank you. And may we have a call to order, roll call, please.
Thank you, Chair Gibbons. Yes. Chair Gibbons.
Here.
Vice Chair Tyson.
Here.
Directors Flygor.
Here.
Elahi.
Here.
Abikoga. And we have heard that Director Abikoga may be delayed a bit this meeting, so we'll move on.
All right, thank you for that. We are at the point where public comment on a matter not listed on the agenda may take place. Do we have anyone wishing to speak? There's customarily a 3-minute limit on this. Do we have any requests? I see we have 8 attendees, but I see no hands raised. So we will move on to the agenda. We have a consent calendar. It is an action item to approve the minutes of the August 27th, 2021 Executive Committee meeting. Are there any comments regarding that, or is there a motion?
Tyson will
So
move
moved.
approval.
Second, Flagger seconds.
I believe that was a motion by Commissioner Director Tyson and a second by Director Flygor. May we have a vote, please?
Chair Gibbons.
Aye.
Directors Tyson.
Yes.
Flygor.
Yes.
Elahi.
Yes.
And Abikoga is not present at the moment. Motion carries.
Thank you. We'll now go to the regular calendar, beginning with item number 2. This is a recommend that the board approve the amended energy risk management policies. Now, as always, we recommend that the board approve. We don't approve. That's why the wording is that way. And I also wanted to just say that I think this is a particularly good presentation because it refocuses, I think, the board, certainly me, on the business that we're in so that we can decarbonize and meet our mission. So thank you very much. And I think we're going to begin this with Monica.
Good afternoon, directors. So I'm sitting in for Amrit Singh today, and so he's really the one to take the credit for this effort. But just as the staff report says, we have a requirement under our existing energy risk management policy, which is adopted by the board, to review our energy risk management policy at least every 2 years, and then to come back to you with, or to the board with a recommendation on whether to retain the existing policy or make any modifications. So for this go around, we actually enlisted the help of Ascend Analytics, Carlos Blanco and Scott Rigglesworth, to do the review for us, so that it would be an independent review. And then they worked with staff, mostly Amrit and my team, to come up with any changes and justification for changes. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Carlos to present the actual changes. I'm happy to be available should any questions come up as we go through this presentation. So Carlos, I believe you are here.
Apologies, I was muted. Good afternoon, everyone. Board members, thank you for inviting me to give this presentation. Thank you, Monica, for the introduction. So over the last few months, we've been reviewing the energy risk management policy. And we would like to suggest a few changes. None of them are large. We looked at some of the changes on hedge bands. Those were the ones that led to more discussions. Most of the other ones are primarily just refinements or clarifying some sections that were sometimes vague or could be updated based on conditions, both in terms of CAISO and the CPUC requirements, as well as the changes in the portfolio of Silicon Valley as well. So maybe we can move forward. So both Scott Rigglesworth, which is the managing director in charge of operations and strategy, and the one that has been working with Silicon Valley for the last few months, yes, on very different aspects of the risk management strategy. And myself, we actually went methodically through the different sections on the policy, and working with SVCE staff led by Amrit primarily, but Monica was very helpful as well in suggesting many of the changes. We are recommending the following. So I think we have about 12 slides. We'll go relatively fast. If anybody has any questions, please feel free to interrupt and ask the questions, and between Monica and myself, hopefully we'll be able to answer all those. So let's go to the next one, please. So in section number 1, under the general scope, we wanted to include a clause that includes acknowledgements of the energy risk management policy. The first sentence actually should say all SVCE employees. It's not just for the representatives. We were not able to make that last minute change, but the final wording will be all SVCE employees and participate in any activity or transaction within the scope will be signing, upon joining, or upon any material revisions of the ERM policy that basically they've read the policy, understand the terms, will comply, and any violation may be subject to discipline up to including termination of employment. And that's a standard clause in many other risk policies by both CCAs and other utilities throughout California and North America. And we thought it was important both to reduce operational risk from actions that may fall outside the policy, and also to reinforce from the tone at the top that ERM policies should guide portfolio management decisions. Any comments or questions? Let's please move to the next one. Right. The second one, for some time, SVCE has been working with third-party providers, both for middle office and back office services. So we just wanted to include just a sentence on the policy, just to indicate that besides just the internal staff performing the middle office functions, there will be some assistance in some instances with third-party qualified service providers such as Ascend Analytics, And some of the main reasons is being determined is cost effective in terms of augmenting the existing staff, also bringing knowledge of industry best practices into the organization, and also employee some of the turnover risks related to people changing jobs and taking that know-how with them. Yeah. Any comments, questions? We're good. Right. Please, next. Right. Next one is just a very small change, but for some time now, both the internal risk committee and the risk committee have been relying on reports that use not just notional but probabilistic based risk exposures, looking at the impact of uncertainty, both in terms of volume and price. And the outputs are already being used in some of the decision support tools that are provided to the risk committees. So we just wanted to make it explicit. All right. Next, please. The following one, in addition to the hedge tolerance bands, which is the primary risk metrics currently being used, or where limits are being set, there's a set of additional decision support analytic tools that are being used to help make informed portfolio decisions and reduce the impact of uncertainty on Silicon Valley's key financial metrics. And some of those metrics that are currently being used and informing some of those decisions are net revenue at risk, reserve requirements at risk, potential future exposure for counterparties, as well as potential collateral exposure. So all of them are forward-looking metrics that attempt to provide some insights into the degree of variability that SVCE may experience as a result of market volume shocks in terms of their cash reserves or potential exposures on the credit risk side. And we wanted the policy to basically include those metrics as well. And the last paragraph is an additional set of tools that will be developed, known as a stress tests, that are going to be looking at basically scenario planning as part of some of the strategic planning decisions, to include some stress events, especially on the summer months for California, where some potential contingency plans could be developed if the results are perceived to be too adverse for the organization. Any comments? Good. Right. Next, please.
I had a question. Are these mathematical formulas that you are using to figure out where we stand in risk management? Or are these political formulas as to what's going on in the world outside, or changes that are happening? I'm just curious.
Excellent.
What goes into all this? You know, this sounds like quite a task there.
Excellent question, Director. So there's many things that go into those formulas. Most of the outputs from the models are coming from large-scale Monte Carlo simulations, from weather, potential load variations, changes on both forward prices on NP15 and any other markets where SVCE may be exposed to, changes also on spot market prices. So there's a large set of variables that the models are basically shocking or fluctuating depending on the expected uncertainty around those variables and the structural relations. So they are relatively complex mathematical models that try to capture all the joint dynamics of SVCE's portfolio, including the uncertainty around renewable regeneration, all the different hedges that are put in place, and then the future states of the world that may be faced. So there's a sort of complex models. They are well documented and used by many other organizations besides in Silicon Valley.
And what is the reliability factor of all these models? I mean, this is almost like predicting where the stock market or Bitcoin is going to go. A lot of volatility. So how do you must be adjusting it somehow, obviously, to get a better reliability factor. Is it 80% reliable or 20% reliable? Do you have any numbers on that?
Yeah, that is a great question as well. So the models don't try to come up with a forecast of what is going to happen. We try to come up with a range of uncertainty around possible outcomes. So many of the models are calibrated from historical data relationships. So to the extent, and then adjusted for the expected future market conditions as renewable penetration increases and we see much more intraday volatility. So the models are a combination of backward-looking and forward-looking assumptions, but rather than trying to forecast a one-point estimate of where we're going to be, we try to come up with many different states of the world, just to try to capture, based on the known information of the uncertainty that SVC is facing, what are some of the baddest scenarios and goodest scenarios that you could be facing, and how to best define what is the right strategy to meet those different market scenarios. But there's not just one, it's not just a forecast. We're looking at a very large set of scenarios to try to inform decisions under those.
I appreciate that. This is like looking at I don't know if you're looking at a crystal ball, but I just thought if you have any idea of what the reliability factor is on the range of forecasts that you might make on these things.
Yeah, that's a good question. So one of the things that was done before we started running the models on a regular basis and keeps being conducted is what we call validation tests, to ensure that the future scenarios that are being produced are basically, they follow certain criteria. So we ensure that the loads that are being generated are within the ranges that we would expect at any given month and any given hour of the day, that the prices that are simulated are within the expectations that these people in the market would understand to be reasonable, then the structural relations that are driving the different variables basically behave as it would be expected as well. So it's not just purely a black box or a crystal ball. There's a fairly detailed analysis that is performed to really understand how those different relations that move the portfolio metrics for SVCE could behave. There's no certainty that the model will predict exactly the type of a scenario we may see in the future, especially with some of the uncertainty around climate risk and some of the newer scenarios we may face. And that's what also stress tests will be added to try to incorporate additional sources of uncertainty that the stochastic models may not produce.
I appreciate that. I was just trying to see if you have a range of reliability based on what you predicted, whether it's going to be, you can rely on it 50%, 80%, 10%, just, or if you don't. I mean, I know this is very complex, and appreciate you're getting into this. But so if somebody, so whatever SVC is using, it has, does it have 100% reliability? Probably not, as you say. But is there any range at all as to how reliable your analysis would be?
Yeah, that's another great question. So to the extent that it's not purely a forecast, it's hard to put like an actual estimate in terms of the exact reliability. But one of the things, since the model has been running, the results in terms of what was the uncertainty predicted by the models for different quarters or different months in terms of the potential, let's say, net revenues or the potential cash reserves that SVC could have at different points in time. Most of the models have been within the range, basic, or the outputs, the realized outputs have been within the uncertainty expectations that the model were predicting. So far, the models have worked, but on a forward-looking basis, it's something that you never know exactly what the future is going to look like. But we try to modify the models and tweak them and bring forward-looking information, try to reflect expected market conditions.
And if I may, Director Tyson may have a comment too. Basically, the model gives a range. It's not a point. It's not a prediction. It gives a range of what the behaviors might be. And then we track along with that. It has been a very, very reliable range that we see coming forward. And if it goes outside the range, we have an understanding of why it went outside the range and what we might want to make a change as a result of. So like last August, it went outside the range. That helped us plan what was coming this year, kind of thing, and where the CPUC was coming. So it's a range. It's a very effective tool for us so far.
Thank you, Dr. Blanco. That was very helpful. Thank you, Chair Evans.
Thank you for the questions. Thank you, Liz, for helping clarify a little bit what the model attempts to do. Excellent. So let's move to the next slide, please.
You're muted, Chair.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, we have two more questions.
Okay.
Jason and then Director Flygor.
Did you say me first?
Yes, please.
Yes, I think you correctly realized I was thinking of saying something, so I unmuted, although I hadn't raised my hand. It's just what I understood you to say was I heard the words Monte Carlo simulation, and this reminds me very much of what, say, I heard what Financial Engines debuted 20 years ago with creating, in effect, a model that has the range of options or of outcomes that Chair Gibbons was just talking about. And you can't ever say, is this 100% reliable? It's just, it's the best model we have. And then as new information comes in, you update it. And so that's what I predict is this is how I would picture you would do this sort of work.
Excellent. Thank you, Vice Chair. Thank you.
And Director Flygor.
Thank you. And I have to say, the explanation from the chair and Director Tyson really helped me better understand what we're doing. Because without these changes that are being shown to us today, my assumption is these analyses were already taking place, right? And if not, I'm curious, what metrics were we using prior to proposing these changes? Or is it that we're required to be explicit in this policy about the metrics that we're using to manage our portfolio?
Can I add, Carlos, that we are using these metrics? We measure them, we report them on a weekly basis to what we call the Internal Risk Oversight Committee. And we report some of them to the Risk Oversight Committee. I think the intent here is just to memorialize it in the policy and to add more rigor around the stress testing, which we do on a more ad hoc basis right now.
Thank you.
Thank you, Director Flieger. So let's go, maybe any other questions? So if we can move to the next slide, please. Right. The following slide just suggests to add language to reflect the cooperation with the scheduling coordinator to manage certain resources and the delegation of authority. The main justification is the scheduling coordinator is going to be executing SVC's generation strategy as necessary. SVC needs to delegate limited authority to the scheduling coordinator with the guidelines of the board approved operating agreement. So there's no changes required on that. And the CEO will be approving the operating plans for the management of the different PPAs. Any comments or questions there?
All set.
Yeah, okay. Please, next. Right. The next suggestion is to extend some of the language around compliance, exception, and reporting in order to define those exceptions a bit more broadly and also set reporting and notification requirements. The prior language was limited to transactions falling outside risk limits and purely an email notification, while we're suggesting the introduction of an exception report that will document, track, and be used to resolve any kind of policy exceptions that may take place if they do. Also, there'll be a summary of the exception reports that will be presented to the board on an annual basis.
I see no questions.
We're good. Okay. So next slide, please. So the next couple of slides were suggesting some changes around both the language and some of the ratios for the tolerance bands. One of the changes on the language is to include the dual objective of both managing power resources to optimize value and load obligations in addition to purely hedge costs. And then add also the fact that SVCE has uncertainty around the generation that will be available from renewable resources and its variability in the portfolio management plan. Yeah. And the main justification is volumetric uncertainty on supply require active management of those resources.
So I sort of look at these as being, I'm going to call it the rails. You know, we're going down at the tracks, but we have these rails and they need to be checked and balanced. Mm-hmm. The gravel underneath, the ballast underneath, all of this, we're constantly challenging ourselves to make sure that we're in a stable process and environment. So this is kind of review is very good for that regard.
Excellent. This slide shows the proposed changes on both the minimum and the maximum tolerance bands for some of the time windows in the future. For the prompt quarter and the current balance of the year, the suggestion is to move from 105% of the expected net open position to 110%. And then for years 4 and 5, there's a suggestion to include the minimums to 50% and then the maximums to 80%, and also bring up year 3 maximum tolerance from 75 to 80% to be consistent with years 4 and 5. And the rationale from those changes, the short-term changes, are to provide additional flexibility to make optimal portfolio hedging decisions based on the variability of the resources and the uncertainty around them. And it doesn't mean that the limit will be, or the net open positions will be very close to the limit, but supply group believe, and as analytics also supports that there should be no flexibility for special circumstances, while years 3, 4, and 5, it's just reflecting the fact that portfolio resources are being added that will bring those limits to those levels. So the 0% for years 5, there would be a compliance exception unless the limits are moved. Any questions or?
So I think Director Flygor had a question. Are you all set now? Okay, and also take note that Director Abikoga has joined the meeting. Okay, so this was the slide that took the most attention and thought at the earlier discussions. And to me, it's an example, as I was saying before, it's at the heart of what we do as a business and how we're managing and controlling it, and whether the right policies and these parameters. So I found this particularly important and was pleased to see how we were making these changes. Okay, if there's no question. Okay.
Next slide, please. Right. The next one, in the existing policy, there were some references to CPUC specific actions that are no longer applicable. So we suggested to move those references out of the policy And the justification is that the resource adequacy rules are constantly being under review by the CPUC, and SVC will continue complying with any future requirement, but it's impossible to anticipate what those exact requirements will be and how they will be changing. All right, comments, questions? All right, and next one, please. All right, this one is a short one. So instead of energy net open position tolerance bands, I'm going to use the term net energy hedge tolerance bands. That's just to be more consistent throughout the policy. Comments, questions? Okay, next one, please. This one has to do with the resource adequacy authority. So we're not making any significant changes. It's mostly simplifying that section. We can see the next slide, and replacing all those different tables by a single table that contains the same term limits, a maturity limit, volume, counterparty, and who will be responsible. But instead of just having the different resource adequacy products, we just have resource adequacy as a general term. The other one is we wanted to base consistent with the previous suggestion was to minimize the references to a specific CPUC resource adequacy obligations, as they will be changing over time. And the suggestion is to maintain, not to provide, suggest any changes to the RA delegation authority by the CEO based on the current limits. Comments or questions? Right. So last one. There was already a paragraph that was talking about the potential conflict of interest from employees that may transact for SVCE. And the change is to have the employees under the ERM policy to sign a declaration of conflict of interest. So there will be a new appendix that would be added to the policy. And the justification is to ensure that all employees under the ERM sign that declaration and declare any potential conflict of interest, so it can be investigated if necessary, and promote transparency and reduce potential legal or reputational risk that could arise if a potential conflict is identified in the future that was not reported. Comments or questions?
I don't see any questions. So I think as you can follow through the presentation, this is a combination of cleaning up, modernizing, correcting, and basically adjusting to all the risk situations that staff needs guidance and policy on.
I think that's an excellent summary.
All right, I think that's done.
Thank you so much.
Okay, we are good. And so the question we have here is if there are no additional questions, then we will open to public comment. Oh, Director Flygor, I see your hand up.
Thank you, Chair. And just a quick question. So confirming that under the current policy, SVC employees were not signing this form. And so we're updating that they do. Is that what that change is doing?
That's correct. We weren't having to sign anything. We had to adhere to the policy. So we had to understand it and adhere to it, but there was not a physical sign off. So with this, if this gets adopted, each one of us will have to physically sign off on this.
And is the definition of employee broad enough to include any contractors we hire, or would this policy not apply to them?
I believe in Girish, I know that there was a discussion about this, that it's only to employees of SVCE.
Yeah, that's what we're looking at. That's a good question. Maybe we can think about that and see if there are certain contractors who may be providing us very critical advice. We may want to do something like that for them to identify conflicts. Yeah. All right, we'll take that back as something to look at.
Thank you. We will now open it to public comment. And we will see if there's anyone from the public wishing to speak on this. There we go. I see no one with their hands raised. I will now close the public hearing and bring it back to the board or the committee here to make a motion, discussion, or make a motion to recommend that the board approve the amended energy risk management policies. Any discussion?
So moved.
Moved by Director Lahi, second by
Tyson,
Director Tyson. Thank you. And we have a roll call vote, please.
Dorothy, please unmute.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Chair Gibbons,
Yes.
Vice Chair Tyson,
yes.
Director Swigor,
Yes.
Elahi,
Yes.
Abikoga.
Aye.
Motion carries unanimously.
Thank you. Knowing we have some directors with time constraints, we can revise the agenda if the group agrees, or we can leave it the way it is. CEO Balachandra, would you like to keep the agenda as is, or would you like to go to item number 4?
Let's see. We are going to lose Nisa in 9 minutes. So why don't we just keep it the way it is? Because I think one of the things I'm going to do in the CEO report is talk about what's coming up in the next several months, and I can touch on what's coming up in item 4 also.
And then everyone can watch the presentation when they have a
Yep.
moment to do so. Thank you.
Yep.
We will now move to item number 3, the CEO update.
Okay, so we're going to get a presentation up, and I'm going to talk to you about a few things. I'm going to skip a slide and actually go to slide number 3. So there were 3 things I was going to talk to you about. First is an upcoming contract with Ascend Analytics, part of the company that Carlos works for, and then talk to you about what's coming up in the next 3 to 5 months. So why don't we actually go to slide number 4, because I think this will be the best use of time for the next several minutes, and then I'll skip back. So if you go to slide number 4. Okay, great. So essentially, here are things coming up. Items 1 and 2, I'd say, are quite operational. 1 is essentially an extension of a contract with Ascend, very similar to the contract we've had with them for the last 3 years. Item 3 is the energy risk management policy update that you just looked at. Item 4 is in response to what the board has directed us to do, which is doubling down on reducing carbon emissions. So we have an overall plan for it. We are looking at it through 2 iterations. So item 4 is to come to the EC today. You're going to tell us whether to come back to you in November or go to the board, but we're just planning you're going to want another look at it before we go to the board in December. If you look to item 9, we will come back. This is iteration 2, will be in Q1 of 2022. So the doubling down strategies, and I want to note that Nisa had indicated when we talked about this, it's emphasizing local agency support and coordination too. So we'll make sure we have that. So that's going to be a significant kind of strategic update, right? And we'll have multiple times to talk about it. Then we have several on power procurement. Those would be item 5 and 10 and 11. So we'll be bringing to you the first long duration storage contract in December. And then the second one will come to you in the first quarter of 2022. And we have new resources to buy as part of the state's new procurement orders. And that's what we refer to as item 11. So those are big power procurement, clean energy procurement issues that will be in front of the board. We will be taking it to the risk oversight committee so they see all the prices and things like that before we bring it to the board. So item 6 is another strategic issue, and that has to do with our clean energy future. When we started our agency, we said we're going to be 100% carbon free, and we did that by buying carbon free attributes that don't actually lower emissions. And that was okay for that time, but things have changed. The state is moving towards more carbon-free energy every hour of the day. And what we're doing doesn't really work. So we're spending money on something that's really not making a difference. And the state and regulators are moving there. Senator Becker, who represents us, he introduced a bill last year, which got made into a 2-year bill, which is essentially moving to the same kind of thing. So we all know to really lower emissions, you have to do something different. So that's going to be, we're going to engage with the board through a series of workshops over the next few months to talk about that. We'll have board elections coming up in January and February. We'll tee it up at the December board meeting. And then item 8 has to do with rates and reserves. When you approved the budget, one of the things we caveated the budget on was we said we're going to get updated projections from PG&E at the end of this year, and we'll come back to you in the first quarter of 2022 to talk to you if we need to make any rate adjustments. There is a connection between item 8 and say item 9, which is the doubling down strategy. If you really want to do a lot more on reducing emissions, it's going to take money. And so that's where rates and reserves come in. And also it's connected to the clean energy future. Just as a bottom line, and I have another slide, but I know I'll lose some people in a couple of minutes. We're spending about $10 million a year to call ourselves carbon free, and we really don't make a difference on carbon for that $10 million a year. So I want to engage with the board on the details of that, because these are trade-offs. If we really want to make a difference and we want to do doubling down, it's all a balancing act, right? So how can we do it while making a difference while still staying affordable? So that's what I had in mind for you, just to tell you, the exec committee, here's what's coming to you in the next 2 quarters, several of them being very strategic issues. I'd be happy to discuss it with you one-on-one also. So let me just stop for a second here, Chair, and see if Director Fligor has any comments maybe before I go on. Okay. All right. Thank you so much. So I'm actually going to shift back, Dorothy, to slide number 2. And I'm going to go through a little detail on Ascend contract. This is correct. Sorry, I should have said slide 3. So back in 2018, end of 2018, the board approved a master consulting agreement with 4 contractors. And that was for $1.22 million. The majority of that master consulting agreement, we've basically allocated to Ascend for data analytics. We basically outsourced a lot of our modeling on risk management to them, and they've also helped with a lot of our procurement valuation. So we would like to continue our relationship with Ascend for the next 3 years. Pretty much the same services, but we want to expand it to middle office functions that would support Amrit. In the past, we used this company called Pacific Energy Advisors, and we ended up having 2 separate models. And since this is the model of record for us, we would like to utilize Ascend for some of the middle office functions. So essentially, this contract with them, it's going to be kind of flexible. There'll be a bucket of hours that we can utilize. If it's not utilized in 1 year, it'll roll over to the next year. This allows them some flexibility to plan their staffing, and it also allows us to not be rigid with our scope, because in some cases we are unable to predict exactly what the scope's going to be. So the cost is 1.3 million over the next 3 years, which is in line with what we've spent in the past. So I plan to bring this to the board for approval at the November board meeting. Any questions?
I don't see any questions. Is this something we would do as a consent calendar item? Oh, I see Director Elahi.
Yeah, when you say middle office work, you're going to give it to Ascend. What exactly are we talking about?
So I may even ask one of the risk oversight committee members to explain that. So in our business, the way we look at energy risk management, you have to divide up the different parts of your business. So the front office are the ones that provide recommendations for trades and purchases and actually do the transaction. But there needs to be another group that's doing the analysis of the risk of that transaction. They will also do things like overseeing payments, also looking at credit and collateral terms. So very similar to banking, Javed, you know, the front office and the traders, and then you'll have the middle office. So we have a front office, middle office, and back office, which with different requirements and responsibilities. So over here, the middle office actually comes up with reports to the Risk Oversight Committee and to myself, basically talking about what our position is, talking about our collateral and credit position too. So that's essentially what they do.
So this is not something that's being done in-house right now?
It's a combination. So Amrit's basically in charge of the middle office, but there's a lot of modeling that needs to be done on a weekly basis to assess our positions. So PEA has done it with support from staff, but we don't have the staff to support the middle office function at this point.
And this is not something you want to build up in-house?
No, we will be. We definitely will. It's a great question. So essentially, and part of the responsibility, the authority you've given me on the labor side will allow me to start to take some of those responsibilities in-house. But there's some things that it just doesn't make sense for us to bring too much in-house. So yeah, so it's going to be a balance.
Thank you.
To answer your question, Liz, yes, on consent.
Thank you.
I have more slides.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so let's get to the next slide, which I may have gone through with you, and then to slide 5. So for the next several board meetings and executive committee meetings, I'm just going to, mostly it's going to be Monica, just talking, maybe we'll pick one slide and talk about the current state of our power system. So I'm talking to Monica, we just said, let's just talk about hydro. You know, California precip levels are almost the lowest it's been in 100 years. And if you look at the slide on the left-hand side, it just shows what the cumulative monthly precipitation in California has been for decades. And you can see that 2020-21 daily precipitation is close to the lowest on record. So what is that? And then on the right-hand side of the slide, it shows what the reservoir levels are on the major reservoirs in California. So for each bar, you see that horizontal red line showing the historical average. And then the blue sub-bar inside is where we are today. You can see in every single reservoir, except for one in Paris, we are below the average. So what do these things mean for us as a utility and as a load serving entity? What that's done for us is it has put a real squeeze on prices. And so prices today in our power markets are close to double what they were last year, which then puts a squeeze on our budget and our net revenue, right? Also, that's kind of maybe a micro view of the next year. But that in combination with natural gas constraints have driven up prices and volatility. So it goes to Javed, your question also, which we had a bit of discussion about in the previous item, about how accurate can we be with these models? And the thing is, it's tough to be accurate in this because it is very volatile. You had a great point about, you're trying to, is this like the stock market? Yes, this is a commodity, and there are various things that are impacting the price of this commodity, and hydro is one of them, and natural gas is another. And so when hydro goes so low and the system gets tight, the volatility becomes even higher. Now, when you think about what does hydro mean for us at SVCE in the long run, we've been using hydro to call ourselves carbon free. And so let me get to the next slide. And this is just a tee up for a further discussion and workshops we'll have with you. Essentially, we call ourselves 100% clean, but let me talk about the top line, the title. We were producing carbon-free hydro from the inception in 2017. It used to cost us about $4 million a year. It's projected to cost us between 7 to 18 million a year. I'm just saying about, say, somewhere to about 15 million. So it's by orders of magnitude higher than what it used to cost us. And hydro supply is not firm, and the states around us are also moving to more carbon-free electricity. So there will be more of a pressure on how much of this hydroelectricity is going to be available for us. So the underlying thing, the 2 points I wanted to make, the previous slide is just talking about the hydro conditions today, how that's along with natural gas prices and the natural gas supply has put quite a squeeze on power prices. And then in the longer run, we'll be teeing up for your discussion as to what our clean energy future should look like. So that's just a tee up. I'm going to stop now and ask if there are any questions in the CEO report.
And I will take note that Director Flygar left at the beginning of this discussion.
Yeah.
And are there any questions? Don't see any hands raised. Then I will move to public comment. Do we have any comments from the public on this item? I see no hands raised. And we will close the public comment. Excuse me. And bring it back for further discussion. And I don't think we have any action item on either of these two. They were informational only.
Yes.
If there's no further discussion, I see none, then thank you very much for that update. And we will move on to item number 4, the doubling down on decarbonization. The manager of our decarbonization and grid innovation policy program is Justin Zuganis, and I'm not said your last name. So Justin, correct me.
It's close. It's Justin Zagunis.
Zagunis, thank you.
Yeah, and thanks for the opportunity to present on this. Really excited to be sharing this with you all and getting some feedback and input. I'm going to share my screen here. All right, are you able to see the screen? Great. All right, so the objective, kind of goal of this presentation really is twofold. One is to kind of just restate and articulate what is the SVCE program approach that we want to be following. I think we have a lot of guiding documents that we've put together, and there's a lot of great thinking that's gone into it, but really pulling it together and kind of crystallizing it in a way so that everyone can see it and kind of sink their teeth into it. Particularly around this idea of doubling down and deploying additional funds and staff resources towards certain key program areas. And as tied to that is also going to be continuing on kind of as we have been with certain programs and deprioritizing other program areas based on kind of how they fall through this lens and really kind of rethinking or reframing of what we're doing with our programs approach. And I want to note that we're in an ongoing process of gathering input from our stakeholders from across the industry, including getting input from you all today. So the takeaway from these slides is really going to be that the focus for SVCE programs is about creating a foundation to enable policy. Policy is really this key driver that is going to get us to an all-electric future, a future of decarbonization, and to do it quickly. But we need this foundation to be in place in order to pass that policy and make that policy successful. Particularly, SVCE's role is trying to target these barriers that we're best positioned to tackle in coordination with our member agencies, leveraging the strong relationships that we have there. And I'll go through some of the build up to those takeaways. And then in terms of the program areas that we've identified, trying to pick a couple that we really think we can make a big impact on and that need a lot of support are multifamily tenant EV access and natural gas phase out. And so I'll give more specifics on kind of what programs specifically those might look like towards the end of the presentation. Tying this back to the 2021-22 strategic focus areas that the board recently adopted, there were 6. This falls firmly in number 6, expanding our efforts on climate change and decarb, and particularly as Girish mentioned in the CEO report, working and to support our member agencies and kind of with you all to try to accomplish some of these things. So we have joint goals. And we want our efforts to be feeding into what you all are able to accomplish. So with that, I'm gonna tee up the program approach here by starting with emissions that we're trying to tackle. So we've shared data on this in the past, but I thought it was helpful to put together a pie chart that kind of shows in descending order these sources of key emissions in our territory. So you can see starting on the top right and then clockwise, they're going in descending order. The big takeaway here for me is, we talk about bending the carbon curve, but really it's a lot of carbon curves, right? There's a lot of different sectors, all of which need attention. There's some shared challenges across sectors and there's some unique challenges. And so we've done a lot of work in the past through our various joint action plans to engage with the industry and learn what the key barriers are for some of these sectors, as well as to articulate some programmatic approaches that we could follow to try to start tackling these and bending these carbon curves down. But I think helpful to look at and just get a sense for where these emissions are coming from. I'm going to leap into an example here on focusing in on residential EVs. So our region has been doing really great at adopting electric vehicles compared with the state, compared with the nation. We're big leaders in that. We're at about 32,000 today in our territory. And I don't say this to be a downer, but there's a long way to go. We have 440,000 more internal combustion vehicles on the road. So the scale of the challenge is very large. That's how we need to be thinking about this. And just again, kind of an illustrative example, if we were to say, what would it cost tomorrow to pay for a full transition to all electric? It's on the order of $10 billion for our region. So it's a lot of investment. Now, over time, as folks reach the end of the kind of natural life of their vehicle and they're considering a new purchase, the incremental cost of EVs is maybe a different thing that you can look at. But this is just trying to get a sense for if we did this tomorrow, it's a lot of dollars that need to go into making this transition happen and happen soon. And even when thinking about EVs writ large, I think really important to think about different customers having different barriers. So I've pulled some data for our territory. These are two adoption curves that I found illustrating market uptake. And so on the left, you can see single family electric vehicle adoption in our territory is about 8%. That puts us in the early adopter phase, but moving a little bit towards early majority. Whereas with multifamily EVs, we're at about 3%, which frankly is higher than I had anticipated. But it puts us, just coming out of the innovators phase and into early adoption. And I think this aligns with what we found in the electric vehicle infrastructure plan when we were looking at key barriers. Multifamily tenants just face a lot more barriers to being able to purchase and access EVs, namely access to charging is a major one that we have seen. Girish, I saw that you maybe had your hand raised. Is that?
Yeah, thank you, Justin. Sorry, did not want to interrupt you, but your voice is cutting out a little bit. And I think I'm just seeing Chair Gibbons also leaning into it, and so I'm just sorry to disturb you right in the middle of your presentation, but such cool stuff. I don't want people to miss what you're saying.
Thanks for letting me know. Let me put my headphones on and see if that helps.
Thank you.
All right, are you able to hear me a little better? Great. Jumping to another example, residential heat pump water heaters. So we have been running at SVCE a heat pump water heater program for the past couple of years, and it has been very successful by historical standards. We've seen a lot of uptake on the order of 100 installs per year, which given the kind of existing programs that have been out there and the rates that they have seen, this is materially larger than what has been happening. So it's a big success. But again, when we think about scaling up and reaching everybody in the territory, trying to, let's say, replace all of the natural gas water heaters by 2030, so in the next 10-ish years, we would need to be doing on the order of 21,000 per year. Right. So it's this market transformation. It's this scale that we're talking about is very large, and it's something that we need to keep in mind just as we're talking about programs. There's direct investment, and we certainly want to be doing that. We want to help people make these installs, but when we think about the future for SVCE and our communities and getting to all electric, it's not something that we're going to be able to just incentivize our way to, right? We need to build the structures so that we can get there. I have another table just kind of looking at some other technologies in our area based on what is out there right now for natural gas and a similar per year adoption requirement that we need to see. All right, so that kind of tees me up into the SVCE program approach. So I know a lot of information, we have a long way to go. We're excited about the challenge. We want to be making progress. We want to get to this zero carbon home for every end use. This is our future fit home image here. But as I mentioned at the outset, the way that we think that will happen is through policy. Policy is necessary to get to 100% and to do it quickly enough, given the urgency that is out there and that we need to be feeling around this issue. I think a good example is LED lighting. Just thinking about policy, that the economic case was there for LED lights. They saved money, they saved energy. They were a good product. But until we saw the mandates come into place, you were not hitting 100% usage, and you weren't going to do it quickly enough. And so we want to do something similar, but with decarbonization. That said, you can't just adopt a policy tomorrow and expect it necessarily to succeed. You need to build this foundation up. And as we think about the foundation, there are 6 kind of pieces. There's cost effectiveness, which is making sure that the incentives and rebates are there, or that the overall economics are in place so that customers are incentivized to make these decisions and are able to make these decisions, as well as addressing upfront cost barriers, such as access to capital that historically can limit particularly low-income folks' involvement in programs or in access to these technologies. There's awareness and kind of overall comfort with technologies. Folks need to know about them and be willing to kind of want them. Into that is products that are competitive. So they need to be able to do the same kind of things that we expect our existing appliances to do. And they need to be on the shelves or in the supply chain so that there's not kind of bottlenecks to actually installing these technologies if folks want them. There's also this kind of process piece. So permitting is kind of one good example. We need to make sure that that's very efficient and that it's not kind of gumming up the works to adoption. So when you think about going from 100 a year to 21,000 per year, that's a lot more permits, that's a lot more inspections, that's a lot more of this process. And so it's really hard to imagine being able to do that volume if this is not streamlined and kind of efficiently put in place. There's workforce, which I know we've talked about before with the board and has been something that's come up. We definitely need to be folks who are able and willing to make these installs. They need to be trained on it. And finally, pilot demonstrations. And so this kind of ties back into these others, but really showing that this isn't just theoretical, but this is real. You can count on these benefits, and this is how it works. So this is kind of the framing. There's different pieces of this support structure that SVCE maybe is better suited to help work on, and that's going to feed into the program recommendations that we're going to get to in a second. But if there's any questions, I guess at this point, I'd be happy to field them.
Thank you, Justin. I'll just offer, we just had an experience in Campbell where the building official rejected 3 residential connections for EV vehicles. And the reason they were rejected is because they were reading a planning code that said everything had to be hidden from the street, couldn't be seen, had to be inside the garage. That was a complete misreading. And fortunately, the contractor had 3 of these situations contacted us, and we were able to figure out what happened and why. But that's where you mentioned earlier about the opportunity. What is it of permitting? What is it of knowledge and understanding that we can make pervasive? Like, can we do a generic or find a way to support a generic installation diagram for permitting, and that all electrical contractors have the same drawing and all cities accept the same drawing and all of that kind of thing? For all of the things that you're talking about, that would be, I'm sure, a great benefit to all of our cities. Director Tyson.
Well, on a somewhat brighter note, I'm pleased to tell you that we had in Los Altos Hills, we had our local climate action group create a presentation for us last night's meeting where they gave two different versions of natural gas phase outs, and our city council voted 5-0 for the more aggressive one. And part of the presentation included the collaboration with Silicon Valley Clean Energy in having certain policies, procedures, training, and permits. And we're focusing on an incentive-based program for our city, realizing how people feel about mandates, recognizing also that after 2 or 3 years, if incentives aren't working, then we may have to turn the page and look at something else. But at least that's what we decided to do last night.
Fantastic. Well done. You're going to share it with all the presentations with all of us, right?
Well, it helps that Steve Schmidt was there, and he's a persuasive kind of guy. I don't know if you know that.
Great, thank you. Any other comments or questions? All right. Well, I'm excited that
We have a couple more slides.
okay,
He was just stopping here for, yeah.
but I want to talk now.
Yeah, just a couple more. So this is kind of the framing of, so what the SVCE program approach. So now when we're thinking about doubling down, what does this mean? Again, through this lens of laying the foundation to enable policy based on what we've been learning so far from the programs we've been running over the past couple of years and the work we've already done to identify some key barriers and solutions in these various sectors. And then thinking about the revenue forecast and the fact that additional budget may be available to kind of go towards programs, we put together what our thoughts are on some key programs that we think would make the most sense to kind of really focus in on from a staff resource and funding perspective. As I mentioned at the outset, those are kind of in the areas of multifamily EV access and natural gas phase out. So the first is Reach Codes 2.0. This is one that I think is all familiar to us and really is a great example of the success of policy. I think, we were able to demonstrate cost effectiveness and kind of enough of the supporting structure that this policy could be passed across our cities. And you see the result of that with the CEC at the state level. I mean, they really were able to and interested in pursuing kind of more aggressive policy at the state level because we had demonstrated this at the local level. So we don't want to lose the momentum that we have built up on Reach Codes. We need to make sure that cities that have adopted Reach Codes definitely need to consider re-upping those codes, or will need to re-up those codes in order to avoid kind of an awkward code lapse, because the building code it gets refreshed every 3 years, and so there is a new code. We want to maintain kind of at least where we had gotten to last time. And ideally, I think we'd like to continue working to strengthen it even further through maybe reducing exemptions or other ideas that cities are kind of interested in pursuing. So this is one we're already moving forward with. We're going to be working with TRC to develop model Reach Codes and do some stakeholder outreach and technical assistance, including meeting with each member agency in December to make sure we're understanding and aware of your goals and objectives. So keep an eye out for that. The second program is permitting simplification. So I kind of touched on this earlier, and Director Gibbons, I think your example is a really great one for this. We need to make sure that that's not getting in the way, and that cities have the resources and the kind of understanding and the processes in place so that this can be done smoothly if we're gonna hope to get to the scale that we need to. Accessible financing is another really big one. And this has major equity considerations also, as I mentioned before, trying to make sure that folks can access the benefits of these electrification technologies and that we're not leaving certain populations behind. We need to make sure that this is in place. Specifically on multifamily EV access, we've been running a technical assistance program focused on multifamily properties, trying to help them consider EV charging and go after incentive funds that are out there. What we have learned from this program is that even with our support and even for programs where there are funds available, it's really hard for multifamily property owners to actually secure them for a variety of reasons, some structural, some just kind of time and interest based. And so we want to kind of continue on and beef up the work we're doing there to include some grants and incentives so that we can make sure that we're getting steel in the ground and kind of some learnings about different approaches that will work to enable EV access in the multifamily properties. On the building side, identified in our building decarbonization plan, we have this whole building electrification program. And so this one, something similar to what SMUD has been running for a couple of years, which is, you can kind of think of it as like a menu-based approach to an incentive program, where when you're electrifying a heat pump water heater, we want to make sure that you are considering and trying to nudge you towards doing a whole home electrification, whether right at that time or preparing you for a future upgrade through pre-wiring, panel upgrades, that kind of thing. So designing it kind of holistically has a lot of opportunities, as well as grants. So focus maybe more on affordable housing or multifamily, where there's really a need to learn a lot more about what some of the costs and barriers are going to be around making a full electrification transition for one of these or some of these types of properties. Finally, the last item here is experimental policy support. And what that includes, to our minds, is really working with cities where there's an interest in kind of testing out a new approach. So something like a natural gas ban, or working on a regional gas system phase out through kind of natural gas pruning, or a retrofit on burnout ordinance that's kind of targeted to a certain city. These are ideas that maybe we want to test out so that we can figure out, are they going to work, and are they things we want to apply at a larger scale? And so by pursuing this, kind of tying it to some of our REACH code effort and making sure that we have resources in place to support the build out of this program structure around one of these policies that we want to test, I think we can really advance the conversation around existing building electrification a lot further. So these are 6 programs. A lot of this is driven, as I said before, by what is a good fit for SVCE and leveraging the relationship with local cities, as well as what some of the key barriers are and kind of the learnings that we've had from our programs to date. This is still a work in progress. Girish laid out some of the timeline, which I'll have in the last slide as well. But we still need to figure out, what is the actual revenue projection and what are we expecting? What does that mean for the budget that we would deploy for each of these programs? What would it mean for our staffing in terms of either expertise or number of people? As well as some of the details on programs. We've laid some of that out, but as we try to double down on them, we might want to change some of the approaches. And then I mentioned at the beginning, but also what programs are we going to deprioritize to make sure we have the time and energy to focus really on these top key ones. And so kind of solidifying all of that is something that we're still working on. And then this is really aligned with what Girish had shared previously, but we're in the phase right now of presenting to you all for discussion. May come back in November, and then we'll present kind of version 1.5 to the board for discussion before coming back in Q1 for the V2 that really has more details on budget, program specifics, etc. And that is the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Good. Thanks, Justin. I think we're still having a little trouble with your audio. But does anyone have any thoughts or questions or enthusiasm? Director Alahi.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I think this is a great effort and hopefully we will get there. I just wanted to find out a few things. Number one, have you had any feedback as to what benefits have been achieved as a result of the REACH codes being passed by a majority of our members? How many new houses, it applies mainly to new houses, whether you have any statistics on those?
I don't have statistics available to me right now. We can definitely follow up with you on that. We are currently just kicking off our evaluation process for the REACH codes, at the end of which we will have a lot more specifics and kind of certainty around what we affected directly and kind of what we can attribute. I will say, I think one of the biggest kind of impacts of the REACH codes, as I mentioned before, is the fact that the state was interested and has been pursuing a more aggressive set of codes, building codes at the state level for this next cycle. So I think that, to me, that's like a really big impact that we caused through our cities making these decisions.
And I mean, the REACH codes was a great start, and we're looking forward to the REACHer codes, I guess, the next step that comes up. The other thing I wanted to ask you is, what has been the greatest barrier for people to go to, carbon-free gas and put in the heaters and the waters? And do you have enough trained contractors out there? Or are there enough people familiar with it?
Great question. I guess I would say what we see is that there can be differences across people and across technology types in terms of which happens to be the biggest barrier for that specific technology. Even with something like heat pump water heaters, in a emergency replacement because your water heater has broken, there's kind of a different set of barriers in place or kind of reasons why you might not consider an electric heat pump water heater than doing kind of a whole home upgrade where you're thinking about electrifying. So I think it depends. I think, yeah, I would say that the joint action plans that we've put together do a pretty good job of, for specific technologies, trying to identify what some of the biggest barriers are for that technology.
Yeah, no,
so I can share some of that.
I understand the Silicon Valley is trying to do its best, but it seems like there's a shortage of contractors who are familiar with it or who know what they're doing. And I don't know how you guys can fix it, because ultimately it's going to be up to the contractors to want to do the job and to be aware of doing it. One other thing I wanted to ask you about, I know we were talking about accessible financing, but that's something that I need to be careful about, because that's where the loan sharks come in. They'll give you all the items that you might need to get a green house, but on the other hand, you mortgage your house and pretty soon you end up losing it, especially in areas where people need the funds. So somehow that needs to be monitored and kept in mind, because that has happened in the past with the home secured type loans. One area of opportunity you may want to consider, SB 9, which is basically a law which allows everybody to go in and take a plot and turn it into 4 plots or 4 houses. And there's a serious consideration being given. One way to have a city maintain its characteristic, if it wants to, it needs to have objective standards, which require certain things to be done. And those may be helpful in not totally tearing up the neighborhoods. One of the objective standards that I think San Jose has passed requires that all new houses have gas. That's right, have no gas. So it'd be all electric things. So that might be an item to consider, where cities could be implementing that as part of their objective standards, that any new houses that are built are gas-free. I know some of our cities have already passed that, but I think it'd be a good tool for cities to consider so they can maintain their characteristics. So you may want to look at the San Jose ordinance. If you want, I can forward that to you. But that should be a part of the toolkit on trying to convince cities to use that as their objective standard, and that way they'll eliminate gas on all new houses.
Yeah, I appreciate those points, and I would love if you could forward that to me. I think it is would fall firmly in the, I guess, reacher codes or the kind of experimental policy support where we could work with some cities that are interested in exploring that route. I think it could be a promising one, as you say.
Thank you.
Very interesting, Javed. Thank you. Director Abikoga.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the presentation. I especially appreciate the numbers you were showing in terms of how many EVs we have and how much more we have to go. And you might have seen my husband, I was showing him how far we have to go. And then multifamily, I guess, you know, for a city like ours, we actually now have rent control on our apartment complexes. And I feel that like that's the challenge, going to be the biggest challenge is how to finance these retrofits. And it doesn't, it sounds, so far, it doesn't sound like there's a lot of opportunity, but do you see on the horizon, like you talked about financing, but you know, opportunities to be able to help these, you know, apartment owners retrofit their older complexes?
Yeah, great question. And I think that part of our effort with trying to, you know, double down on that kind of program area in particular is because we know it's really hard. And so we want to make sure we have the focus and resources devoted to that so that we can try to tackle it. I'll note that we have been running a pilot with Ecology Action that's focused on kind of low power, low cost upgrades to deploy some charging at multifamily, particularly at low income or deed restricted multifamily. And so there are some approaches that can get some number of chargers in place, but I think to your point, when we think about at scale and kind of the number of chargers that we'd like to have to support everyone to have an EV, it's going to be a challenge. And so that's where something like the financing comes in. I'm not sure that I have seen the perfect solution yet that seems like it's going to fix that. And so I think it's a really powerful opportunity for us to be trying to see if we can establish that.
So in light of that, when you talk about policies, what kind of policies are you thinking of that cities could pass to? Because I just, you know, we can't mandate it, these retrofits, right? At least I don't feel like we can here in our community, in our city, because of our rent control or laws and ordinances and the inability to recoup the costs because of that. But yeah, what would you see? I guess they're incentives. Is that kind of what you're looking at as policy opportunities? And then what kind of incentives could we be looking at?
I think so I'll say that I think for different cities, there will be different things that maybe can be considered or will work with the specifics in that area. So that's, I think, really a great point from you, like that's not something that Mountain View would be able to do tomorrow. Thinking back to the sort of framing of eventually getting to policy, I think it really is how can we deploy a set of programs such that maybe we are able to actually have that be a policy because the funding mechanism is in place or the process is so smooth, or we've kind of built up enough that we are able to do that. In the near term, I would say even if we can't adopt a policy at like a city scale, there are some regional or targeted approaches, neighborhood level, maybe something targeting particularly low income housing so that we can kind of help that population first so that for a future requirement, there's kind of less of a concern around that. I think there are a lot of kind of innovative approaches that we could follow to help allow a policy to be adopted. But I agree, it's not something that we can just do tomorrow.
Thank you.
Thank you. I would offer an answer to Javed's question about what's holding it up. People won't give up their gas stoves. One of the you also brought up about loans. There are programs like PACE. Are you familiar with that? That's where people do energy improvements and then they take a loan or with something against their house. There's a word for it. So that's an organization or an approach that's worth considering. I don't know whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. And I see Director or CEO Balachandra, you have your hand up.
Sorry, it's just not answering your question, but it's more of what we'd like from the executive committee at this meeting.
Yes.
Is we'd like to move this to the board, but right now we are thinking if there's feedback from the exec committee, we'll come back to you with further information at the November meeting before going to the board in December. If you think we are good enough right now where we can take this to the board in November, great. So that's kind of the feedback. We're planning on 2 meetings with you before we go to the board, but if you think you're good taking it to the board in November, that's what we'll do.
I sort of would like with a little more myself. I would like to see a little more depth, a little more specificity. Yeah. Anyone else? My Director Abikoga.
Thank you. I agree with the chair. And I guess what would be helpful is to make it as easy as you can for cities to do something. So I think that was what, Reach to the 1.0. It was very, frankly, very simple. What we had to do. So if you can just pick 2 or 3 things that would be the highest rate of return, I guess you could say. And I know that, like you said, every city is different, but at least like a menu of options on what a city can pick to do, that would be super helpful, I think, for our staff, so that it would minimize the work that they need to do in researching.
Great comment. Anyone else? Yes, there you are. Okay.
I don't disagree with the value of what was just said, but I feel like this is very interesting and largely ready to go.
Let me ask the question slightly differently. What does staff want the board to make as a decision when they see it?
No real decision at this point. So frankly, we just want to make sure it's almost like direction. Are we directionally correct? So the kind of feedback we're getting right now is providing us some specificity on what we need to do. So there's very good feedback, like what Margaret just said about, hey, can you get a little more specific about what we can do in a city? That's useful. So if we get that kind of feedback, then we can come back to you in the first quarter of next year with a budget. Here's what it's going to take to actually put this together. So it's that level of feedback we need from the board too.
So I think what we've done in the past in these meetings, I see Javit's hand up, is we're trying to provide information to you and staff on how to best communicate to the full board and what it is that you want to get from the board. So I think that's where our comments are heading towards. And Director Elahi.
Yeah, I think it's an important presentation, so it'll be good to beef it up. I mean, some of the questions that you guys still need to explore is like, what is the benefit being of the REACH codes? How many houses have actually been upgraded to it? What else needs to be done? How many contractors are out there who can actually provide installation of heat pumps? And how many have they done? I mean, maybe that's getting too deep into it, but still, I mean, if you have one contractor who's done 5 and another one's done 2, it'll be good to know whether this is going anywhere as far as contractors are concerned, or whether some other training needs to be implemented. And that may be something that the SVC you guys need to come up with to push that out, because it might be a bigger priority if there's nobody out there. I mean, I can give my example. I know somebody came to my house to put in a heat pump, and then I've never heard from the guy again. I had a quote from somebody who wants to do a roof installation, and I've never heard from them either. So I don't know if that's me or if something else is going on out there. But it'd be good if you guys have those kind of statistics and see across the valley what's going on. That's some of the things that might be helpful, and they'll help you plan your budget also. So yeah, this is an area where we need to focus more. All right.
Okay, so I think some of those summary comments were quite good. I think we're going to have to leave it up to staff at this point to see whether you should move forward or not. Can we pass the buck back?
Completely. It's passed and caught. I'll just leave it one last comment on the contractor training. We've started our launch of our contractor training program. So it's more of a soft launch right now. So our goal is to get to 1,000 contractors that will have taken the five hours of online training, and we would give them $500 as a stipend and up to $5,000 of rebates for them to put like an electric heat pump in their own home. So Javed, you have hit this. It's not just us, it's the state as a whole. What are the policies the state needs to adopt, and their licensing requirements? Is a lot being talked about right now. And so we're looking at what can we do that could move the needle. So we'll take that question in your comment into our next steps. Thank you very much, Liz.
Okay, so thank you. And now we have 4:20 and we have 2 other items to cover. How would you like to handle that?
I think from a criticality standpoint, item 6 needs to get done now. So I'm sorry, Don Bray, if the board is choosing, I would have to go with item 6.
Fair enough. There's no rush on item 5, and I think it's pretty straightforward. We may be able to even bring it to consent as a consent item. It could always get pulled.
Yep, we'll make a choice on that. But if Monica is able to do this in double quick time, maybe the chair will find a few minutes for Dawn to come back.
All right, thanks. So we will defer item 5 and go directly to item 6.
It's me again. I'm just waiting for the presentation to come up, Dorothy. I'm hoping you're loading it. But while she's loading it, I'll just give a little bit of background. So obviously, we've talked a lot about signing power purchase agreements and how much we're doing to bring on new renewable resources onto the grid. And so now we're at the point where we're actually having to figure out how we're going to operate these resources. And so we had the benefit of having an extremely valuable partner in this whole endeavor to procure, and that was with Central Coast Community Energy, which when we first started was called Monterey Bay Community Power. And so because we've done a lot of our procurement jointly with Central Coast Community Energy, or I call them 3CE, we're now in a position where we need to formalize some of our relationships, because a lot of what we've been doing, both in terms of procurement and discussions about how we're going to operate our resources and how we're going to settle our resources and how we're going to communicate with our scheduling coordinator, has been very informal. So this coordinated operating agreement is really about putting some formality around the relationship that we have with Central Coast Community Energy. So we can go to the next slide. Just quickly, you've all seen this slide, but we've signed 13 PPAs, including 12 of which we signed with Central Coast Community Energy. And we have our first one that has been delivering what we call test energy. So this is energy that gets sent to us and gets put onto the CalISO grid before we actually declare a commercial operation date. So they're testing the systems and their ability to do everything that they need to do with the CalISO. And we're doing all this through our scheduling coordinator. And so if you recall back in, I believe, March, April, we hired Z Global to be the scheduling coordinator on behalf of 3CE and SVCE to schedule these resources into the ISO. So as a scheduling coordinator, what Z Global has a responsibility to do is to basically be available on a 24/7 basis and to every day determine how they're going to submit a schedule to the ISO on how we're going to utilize our resources, both the solar component of it or wind component or geothermal. And in the case if we have a battery, how the battery is going to be scheduled into the ISO. And so that's a big responsibility that we put on Z Global for all of these resources. And then in addition to that, Z Global will do all the work necessary with the Cal ISO to ensure that we're getting paid properly for the resources that we put onto the ISO. Because if you recall, after a few months or years ago, we did a workshop on how the Cal ISO works. When we have resources, we bid them into the ISO and the ISO pays us for them. And they pay us for them based on an hourly basis. And so there's a lot of information that gets transferred between the Cal ISO to Z Global and then from Z Global to us and 3CE. So we're working all of those systems and processes and needs out as we speak. We're excited that I think we have a clear path forward, but we need to be able to memorialize a lot of the stuff that we're doing with 3CE. So next slide. Again, of the CCAs that we've signed, 13 in total, this is the schedule on how we're going to bring those CCAs online. Many of our CCAs, especially the ones for solar plus storage, are new projects. That means they're being built, they don't exist already. And a lot of the other ones are existing resources, which we're just waiting for the transfer of the rights to utilize those resources to come to us. So we've got a lot to do over the next 9 quarters. And so I think I've shared this slide with you as well. So next slide. This is just more details around the 12 PPAs that we share with Central Coast Community Energy. And so in many cases, we, the buyers, are the scheduling coordinator. And we outsource that function to Z Global because we don't have the capabilities in-house to be available on a 24/7 basis. And we don't have the software that's required by the Cal ISO to be able to bid resources into the ISO. And so that's a very unique role that one plays in the market, and it requires a highly skilled set of resources and staff. And so it's better outsourced in this case because we haven't built up those functions. One other thing to note here is that we have 2 types of PPAs that we've signed alongside 3CE, and those include what we call buyer share and separate, and I'll explain a little bit more about those. And then the last thing to note here is that for the most part, we split our PPAs kind of equally 50-50. There's been some cases where SVCE has wanted more than 3CE of a particular project or vice versa. And so these have all been negotiated splits when we were doing the negotiations in entering into these contracts. Next slide. So the buyer share versus non-buyer share PPAs. So a buyer share PPA is one where we essentially have one project and one facility kind of identifier with the Cal ISO, so 1 meter. And everything gets scheduled in a coordinated manner. And so we have to agree on how we're going to dispatch the solar and the battery component into the ISO. We have to agree on an economic strategy there. And then we just split the costs and benefits equally, or whatever our proportionate share is for that contract. Our contract that we have with the developers for buyer share type arrangements obligate us to coordinate operations with 3CE. So they can't accept 2 different strategies or bid strategies for one facility. It's just not technically feasible. And then the other types of agreements that we have, the non-buyer share, or we also call them separate, they're essentially 2 individual resources or facilities in the eyes of the Cal ISO. 3CE has its ID, it has its meter ID, and we have our own meter ID. So technically we could operate these very separately. I could send my set of instructions to Z Global, and Z Global will then send them to the ISO, and 3CE can set their own set of instructions to Z Global, and Z Global would send them to the Cal ISO. But, you know, there was a reason that we did joint procurement together, and for that reason, we're actually talking about operating some of these non-buyer share or these separate resources in a more coordinated fashion. I can go to the next slide. So again, the initial intent was to share in resources, cost, and risk. And under the buyer share agreements, that's already kind of naturally done. We share everything by a proportionate share. Under the non-buyer share agreement, that's not the case. And so however my facility or SVCE's facility performs, we will get the benefit or the obligation associated with that facility. And if for whatever reason something happens to that facility, or it's delayed in its output, or it gets curtailed by the Cal ISO, those are my liabilities. Those are SVCE's liabilities, and they're very separate from 3CE's liabilities. But as I mentioned many times, our intent was to share in that risk, and so we've developed kind of a mechanism where we could, in fact, true up some of those obligations and benefits under very limited conditions. And if we go to the next slide, we can talk a little bit about that. Oh, I'm sorry. Go back. Sorry. Yeah, so the types of events that I'm talking about really would be limited to one of our facilities having equipment failure that is, again, outside of our control. If there's a forced outage because the facility went out because of some bad equipment that is outside of our control, or again, because the Cal ISO has issued more curtailments on one resource or one facility versus another. And so those are kind of the limited situations where we would want to share in some of the costs with 3CE and vice versa. So next slide. So the purpose of the Coordinated Operations Agreement, which is really what we're here to talk about today, is to basically establish that framework of how we're going to coordinate operations and communicate and make decisions, but also how we're going to have this true-up mechanism. So if we didn't have the true-up mechanism in place, everything else is purely operational in nature, and it's really not a policy discussion or a policy issue. It's things that we have to do because our PPAs require them, or because the Cal ISO requires it, because since we operate in the Cal ISO, or because it's something that the scheduling coordinator needs in order to be able to affect our bids and strategies into the Cal ISO. But because we want to be sharing some of these resources, and because our PPAs, the ones that have the buyer share mechanism in it, requires that we coordinate our operations, again, as I mentioned, we just need to have an agreement to formalize some of this stuff. And I'm going to skip to the next slide. I'm not going to go through all these things here because I know that we're trying to get through another item. So next slide. So the Coordinated Operating Agreement itself, again, is just an agreement that talks about how we're going to work together. There is no real cost associated with the Coordinated Operating Agreement other than the resources, the staff time that is going to be needed in order to manage and administer the COA. But that's all stuff that we would do regardless if we had a Coordinated Operating Agreement now, because we have to coordinate operations with 3CE in many cases. The cost to support a lot of the functions that are required to operate these PPAs have already been budgeted for or contracted through separate agreements, again, through our scheduling coordination agreement with Z Global, or through our legal and consultant contracts that we have to administer the PPAs. So the COA, again, doesn't add any additional costs. The one cost that we may have because we've decided to true up on those resources where they're not a buyer share, that is their separate agreement, might be something, we don't think it's going to be very much. It could be less than 100,000 per year, We would do this every year. At the end of the year, it would be a net number. And we don't expect there to be any true up in this current fiscal year that we've budgeted for FY22. The first time that we would see a true up mechanism come into play would likely be in fiscal year 23. But if it did, for whatever reason, happen in fiscal year 22, we would come back for that. But we're again anticipating to be pretty minimal. And then the coordination of the buyer share PPAs, as I mentioned, is required. And without an agreement, it could be very cumbersome and could actually lead to situations where we're not in agreement with 3CE and we don't have a process to spell out how we're going to come into agreement. And that could cause us actually money in terms of not being able to make a decision or making poor decisions, or possibly even having to go into some kind of dispute with 3CE, which we don't want to do. You know, we've signed lots of contracts with them. We want to have a very amicable relationship throughout the period or the term of these contracts. And as I mentioned, the coordination of the non-buyer share, while it is not necessary, it is something that we desire to do to, again, follow through on the intent of why we entered these contracts together with 3CE. That said, we have the option to add these non-buyer share agreements to the coordinated operating agreement one at a time. If at any time we feel that it doesn't make sense for us to operate these in a coordinated fashion with 3CE, we can take that agreement out of the COA, provided we give 30 days notice, and then we have no other obligation to 3CE to operate or true up that non-buyer share agreement with them. The term of the COA is set to be the longest term of the buyer share PPA. Again, so we have the obligation to coordinate there, and that's 20 years. The next slide. In terms of next steps, so we've already, as I mentioned, been coordinating operations with 3CE. We've been doing this for the last few months, and really kind of a lot of momentum has been happening in the last couple of months as we bring on the first solar plus storage project, the Slate project. So that's already in place. What we would be doing next is just finalizing the coordinating operating agreement. You know, we're probably like 95% there, very, very close, just a couple of cleanup items, and then bring it to the board for a delegation of authority to the CEO to finalize and execute the COA. And we hope to do that in November. So in terms of requests from the executive committee, and I didn't put it in here, I apologize for that, is our request is that you recommend that the board approve the COA when it comes on November 10th. And I believe it's scheduled to go on consent. So with that, I'll take questions.
Thank you, Monica. This is another meeting issue. Do we have any questions? Yes, Director Elahi.
Thank you. Yeah, no, it's quite involved, and I guess just trying to understand the basic is helpful. So this is we're producing the electricity, and we're selling it to the ISO. Is that what's going on? And then
Yes.
and then from somewhere back there, it comes back to our consumers, or it's just sold, and all we're doing is we're in the business of producing and selling electricity.
Yeah, so if because we operate within the California Independent System Operator, kind of what we call the grid, we all put electricity into the grid, and think of it as a swimming pool of sorts.
Right.
Every generator who produces electricity, including those of us who have bought these long-term PPAs, put that energy into this big swimming pool, and then all the load pulls from that big pool. So it's hard for us to say specifically that we're going to get electrons from this particular project, because it all kind of goes into this one big grid, and then we all pull from the grid at the same kind of in a dynamic time. And so the way that financially it works is we pay our seller or our supplier at the PPA rate that we've committed to, and then at the same time, for every hour, the ISO pays us for that electricity that gets generated. And that price will change every hour of the day.
So we're paying our supplier, the ISO is paying us something out of that. And then as far as the consumer is concerned, they're paying us and PG&E from or paying us, I guess, in most cases. So somewhere it balances out.
It does, yeah.
All right, that sounds good. The question I had is, you've got buyer share and non-buyer share. With 3CE, we are working together. Is there any issue of competitive bidding? I mean, we may want to, or does the ISO establish a price for purchasing, and that's the standard price, or do we get to negotiate what price we're selling it to them at? And there's and can 3CE come in and say, no, we'll sell it to you at a lower price?
Yeah, so what our requirement is that on a day ahead basis, we have to say how much what our maximum and our minimum bid requirements are from the ISO. So we'll say we want to take whatever price the ISO publishes, that's what we'll get paid, or only operate my resource or my facility if I can get this much money. And so that's our bid strategy. And then the ISO does they run their whole model or tool, and it's like a stacking of all the resources and everybody that wants something, and then they come up with the hourly price. And so we don't get to negotiate with the Cal ISO on what the hourly price is. We only get to decide whether we want our resource to generate or not by putting in kind of a bid price into the ISO. And so that's what we have to coordinate with 3CE, is how much are we willing to kind of take for our resource. And if we don't want to bid it in for whatever reason, why don't we want to bid it in? Is it because we think the price is going to be too low, or we want to save it for something else? That we have to come up with that every single day with 3CE.
So I understand that would happen for the buyer share where you're both putting it in together, but there is a non-buyer share where each one is independently deciding what they want to put in. So is there a chance that what you bid and what 3CE bids are two different numbers, and could that hurt us basically because they're underbidding, or could we hurt by underbidding?
If we put a non-buyer share PPA into this arrangement that we've created, this coordinated operating agreement, then we've essentially obligated ourselves to come up with one bid with 3CE. So we would coordinate on that. If we don't put the PPA into this arrangement, then we would communicate directly with our scheduling coordinator on how we wanted to bid that resource. For now, our intention is to coordinate all operations with 3CE, and because we just believe that it makes sense. We have shared objectives right now in terms of how we want to operate these resources, for what purpose, and we have no reason to believe that it doesn't make sense for us to come up with one bid strategy.
Yeah, no,
that could change, and if it changes over time, then we would take it out. And no, we're not competing against 3CE. We are basically making our resource available to the Cal ISO, and if our price clears, the Cal ISO pays us. If our price doesn't clear, then we don't get paid. But there's no competition with 3CE.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. So I think the question before us is it appropriate for the executive board to recommend to the full board approval of a coordinated operating agreement? We're not talking about the terms because staff is continuing to work on that, but they're asking, do we support the coordinated operating agreement approach for the non-buyer separate agreements we have with 3CE?
Yes.
Okay. All right. I'm seeing one affirmative yes from Director Tyson. I'm also in support of this. Director Abikoga is as well. Director Elahi?
Yeah, that's good.
Okay, so I think that gives you the direction that you were looking for that item. It is now a roll call. And do we have I guess we need a motion for that. A motion from Director Tyson, and I'll take a second from Director Abikoga. I think the two of you the vote first.
Yes, roll call. Chair Gibbons,
Yes.
Vice Chair Tyson,
Yes.
Director Elahi,
Yes.
Director Abikoga,
Aye.
And it's noted that Director Flagler has had a previous commitment and had to leave the meeting early. The motion carries.
Thank you. Excellent. So do we have people's time to do one more item, or are we, what do we need? Another 15 minutes, 10 minutes?
15 minutes max. This is, and we can end on a high note. This is good. This is money we have to spend on some awesome programs.
So I have an event at 5 o'clock and I read the slides and it looked like a really nice plan for how to spend $600,000. And it had to do with the incentive for the multifamily charging and the other thing.
The portable batteries.
Yes.
So why don't I do this? I will read it into the meeting for item number 5, and then we can decide if we need to have a presentation by staff or not.
I actually need to get going too, so if we can just, I'm happy to make a motion that we.
So I have to read it in.
Okay.
Item number 5, the program proposal for $600,000 in 2020 savings from PG&E carbon-free attributes. And the motion is to approve the program and the expenditure as a recommendation to the board, right? Okay.
Yes.
And if everyone's in understanding of that, then I would take a motion from Director Abikoga and a second from Director Tyson. And may we didn't do a public comment. We need a public comment. I see no public comments. So we'll bring it back for the motion to be completed with a roll call, please.
Yes, Chair Gibbons,
Aye.
Vice Chair Tyson,
Yes.
Director Elahi,
Yes.
Director Abikoga.
Aye.
As noted, Director Flagler is absent. The motion carries.
Great.
My best presentation ever.
You get to make it next time. You still want to listen to the presentation.
Okay. Have we covered our bases correctly on all other items? Okay. All right. In that case, goodbye, everyone.
Right. Have a nice weekend, guys.
Bye.
Have a good weekend. Thanks.
Good night.
Enjoy your
you all.
evenings.
Thank you.
Bye.